Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar this evening. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. Okay, a little technical problem there. That's fun. Welcome, everybody joining us. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. Do let me know if you can, this is all coming across clearly as you're in here early, and so we can resolve any issues. We've got a chat thing. Just let us know if you can hear my voice and the video's coming across nicely. And you can see Daniel and hear Daniel's voice too. Daniel, can you speak this evening?
Hello, good evening, everybody. Welcome.
Okay, that's great. Also, for some reason, a lot of you have come in as Maria Pacer, who's actually our technical person on a student support team. But for some reason, you've all managed to come in with Maria's name. So if you could rename yourselves, that would be super helpful. I think you can do that. I think you can. If not, it's going to be quite tricky because I won't know actually who's asking questions because 80% of you are called Maria. I don't know how that happened. If Maria's there, I don't know how that happened, Maria. But oh well, we like Maria a lot. She's amazing, and she's here a lot. So you'll have to put your name in. Your if you make a comment, you're going to have to put your name
Sign,
in.
yeah, just sign in.
And
Yeah.
because then I can we can address it. Oh, Malcolm's renamed himself. Malcolm, well done. Fantastic. If you could do that, that would be great. Otherwise, it's going to get quite
Do we have a link on YouTube as well? Or?
Yes, the oh, Daniel wants to know we are live on YouTube, everybody.
Oh,
So
okay.
just behave yourselves and let's get Daniel the link there so that he can share it out. Hold on. Daniel, there is the link on YouTube as well. So yes, if anybody can manage, some people have managed to rename themselves. If you can, that will be super helpful because I don't know how this occurred, but it is a little confusing that you've all come in as Maria. We're going to look and see what that's about. Maria's sending me lots of frown emojis right now. Anyway, we will manage like this, but do put your names in. You also have I think you have a Q&A panel. Maybe we don't have a Q&A panel this evening. Let's just check on that. Maybe we don't have a Q&A panel. You'll need to put your questions into the chat here. I'll be monitoring that as we go through. So good evening, welcome everybody. Let's get started now. It's my name's Mark Davis. I'm director and principal at the UK College of Hypnosis and Hypnotherapy. I know quite a lot of you. I recognize some names here, certainly Maria's. And joining me this evening, I'm really delighted to have with me dear colleague and friend, Daniel Mirea, professor. No, he's not Professor, but we think of him as Professor Mirea because Daniel is so knowledgeable and experienced and has a professorial aspect to him as well as being a lot of fun and very dynamic and very creative and a brilliant trainer and communicator about psychotherapy in general and particularly about cognitive behavioral therapy in all its 57 varieties. We're going to talk about all 57 varieties this evening, or to the extent that there's not one just set thing called CBT. That's one of the things I think we'll probably want to get across. So delighted to have Daniel here tonight. We're going to really try and start off by getting into some of the basics here about kind of what is CBT, what do we mean by it, how's it different, and address that in a very simple way and some simple ideas about it, and then start to build into different issues, including looking at some challenging questions that I've cooked up for Daniel. So Daniel, would you like to introduce yourself very briefly so people have some idea of where you're coming from when you're answering these questions and talking about CBT?
So my name is Daniel Mirea. We all know that by now. I'm the former head of CBT and psychopathology at two universities, actually, almost ran those jobs in parallel, Regents and Middlesex. I'm one of the earliest accredited CBT therapists in the country, simply because CBT was not really a thing within the psychotherapeutic community. Well, psychotherapy was not a common method of treating psychiatric conditions back in the late 80s, early 90s, when I got started with my career in mental health. So I was lucky enough to be at the right place and at the right time, involved with this fascinating type of school of psychotherapy. We're going to dive more into it, I'm sure. Long story short, I've been doing this for 35 years or so. I have been teaching, writing doctoral programs, master's programs as well. I still am, but I'm not. I don't belong to a university as such. I work clinically with a variety of different patients. I'm very much involved with the college. I'm a big fan of hypnosis in general and this modality, not Hypno-CBT, which makes a lot of sense to me. And I haven't yet met a CBT therapist that's been introduced, frankly, to Hypno-CBT and felt, well, this combination is somehow doesn't add up. So here we are, 35 years down the line, moving on, continuing to progress. And it's interesting, but as we talk about progressions, and maybe I'll stop with this. It's going to come up at some point. But I was refreshing my memory earlier by going over an article from Frontiers of Psychotherapy, who credited CBT, Frontiers of Psychiatry. There's this journal who published a very pretty accurate article about CBT, hailing it as the golden standard of psychotherapy. But also, the way they described cognitive behavioral therapy, which is an umbrella term for a variety of different types of evidence-based psychotherapies, including Hypno-CBT. They've described it as an evolving psychotherapy-based research program, a progressive research program. I think that's quite nice, a progressive research program. I don't know if that makes sense to people, but it's somehow research is at the base of the core of everything that we do in Hypno-CBT and CBT.
So, well, let's just pick up that point there. So you're saying basically this is a very research-informed approach, both in ongoing development, but I kind of want to back up a little bit from that, because I think it's also, even in its very origins, it's born out of kind of research in psychology, right? I mean, in terms of conditioning approaches and things like that. So it's very, the whole thing is birthed from an informed research in psychology, not necessarily into therapy, just even into how people solve problems or how fears get conditioned, etc. Can you speak to that, Daniel? The kind of experimental research basis nearly of the program's development.
Yes, yeah. I think people forget that even things like the attachment theories, such as the attachment theory, it doesn't belong to psychoanalysis. Bowlby is a psychologist and a psychiatrist, and he came up with this concept, or was rather, Bowlby. That's during the earlier days of psychology as a science, and behaviorism and cognitive psychology started to take shape soon after that. Pavlov's research.
Let's just unpack attachment. Give people a quick
yeah,
1 minute primer on attachment theory, so we're not everybody can stay up to speed with what we're talking about. Let's not use any jargon here.
Okay, okay. So I'll try not to do that. So attachment is there's a misconception out there that somehow attachment belongs to psychoanalysis, which is the Freudian stuff, right? It's just simply not the case. Attachment refers to our earlier years and how the kind of relationship that we have with our parents, the kind of bond, the kind of attachment we develop with our parents, that type of relationship will have an imprint on us, will help us develop, navigate through life during the earlier years. And then we continue to use the same template from these earlier years later in adolescence and adulthood.
So this is attachment theory essentially, and which put a lot of value of predictive value on those early things, right? It's saying this early stuff is going to predict a lot of stuff. Yeah.
And CBT has embraced that concept and took it further by saying, well, actually, it's a bit more nuanced than that. It's a bit more interesting than this, because those earlier years leave a very specific imprint on us. They leave a very specific set of values. And those values are going to be quite often expressed verbally in judgments, for instance, that we have about ourselves and people that we come in contact with and life in general. Say, for example, if I don't perform at 100% level, then I'm not going to be respected, or I need to always show my worth and my contribution by working really, really hard. I'm not going to be appreciated and accepted by others unless I work hard. Things like maybe our parents, we might have grown up with parents that imprinted on us this concept of, you should always be respectful because our neighbors' opinion about you matter to us and should matter to you too. And that could well be true in my earlier years. Maybe that's the community I was raised in, and their opinion matters. It's very important to me. But later in life, I moved to London, a huge 10 million cosmopolitan city. I can't take care of everyone. I cannot possibly be interested in everyone's opinion about me. So I need to upgrade those values that I grew up with. So you see, this is CBT's contribution. What we're saying is, yes, those early years, Freud, Jung, they were always right. Those early years are so important. But what we've learned from this, so here's the learning theory. What we've learned from this needs to be either unlearned because it has no longer applicability, value to my current context, or needs to be upgraded to my current situation. And it's this upgrade that we're very much interested in delivering during a cognitive behavioral process, in a way.
I mean, in a way, we could say that process of continual learning and updating and adapting and being influenced by is given and that is an ongoing process all throughout all your days and years, is given much more credence and focus in CBT than it is in other approaches that kind of say, well, whatever happened in childhood, that's kind of set. Whereas we're looking at actually a far more complex picture that says, no, that gives a certain sort of direction, but then your system's updating, or if it's not, then that's interesting.
Yeah,
right?
That's interesting too. Why is it not updating, and what can we do about that?
Yeah.
But you see, this is the nature of CBT. We're touching on another crucial domain here. It's not just how dynamic it is, how progressive it is, how informed by clients' life experiences over the years is, not just what happened in the past, but also what happens today, much more relevant, and what they wish to happen in the future. Where do they want to go from here? It's problem solving. It's solution focused. And it doesn't pretend not to be. We do not pretend that we are not guiding our clients or our patients toward a desired solution, towards where they want to get to. We do not pretend that some might say, some critics would say, well, that's a little bit like coaching. So if that's what coaching is, then we coach as well. We're teaching as well. We're guiding. That's stoicism. If we look, this is again, we bringing in yet another domain, philosophy. Stoicism talks about the development of self-control as means of overcoming destructive emotions, right? That's what the purpose of, that's kind of the main philosophy behind it. And I'm no expert on Stoicism, but I know a little bit about it to notice the obvious overlap with the cognitive behavioral method of teaching. We're teaching clients, we're guiding clients, we're helping them become their own therapist, an expert, a true expert in their lives, and how this inner world that they're not often aware of, how is that inner world exploiting them, taking advantage of them sometimes, and holding them back? And how can they enhance their ability to just move on and reach their potential? That's Stoicism to me.
So I want to come to that, and also this idea about problem solving and as being no, I mean, we know it's a therapy approach in CBT. It's one of the kind of but it is a way of thinking about what we're trying to achieve. But before we do that, let's just step back more broadly and say, well, if we had to look at some of these psychotherapies, Daniel, and apportion them, how much they focus on the past, 90%, 5%, the present, 90%, 5%, the future. I think that's quite an interesting way to kind of say, well, some therapies are kind of even more focused on the future, your goals. Some are like very present focused, or an immediate short-term goals today, tomorrow, this week, and what's actually happening now. And some are very focused on what's happened in the past. So could you speak to that, and maybe just in a completely insanely sort of simplistic exercise, give some percentage ratings?
That is such a tough question, and I'm going to make a lot of enemies here. Look, every school of thought, every type of psychotherapy has something to contribute, but the reality is that nobody has looked at research and investigated so many different domains, from the world of physiology and psychology, behaviorism, cognitive processing, and so on. Nobody has looked into these domains, neuroscience as well, neuroaffective research. Nobody has done it better or more intensely than the schools that come under the umbrella of cognitive behavioral therapy. So there's nobody can come close to that. In terms of percentages, I would say psychoanalysis focuses far too much on the past, and everything that an individual does today is somehow related to the past. There's some truth in that, maybe to a degree, but there's maybe less acknowledgement of other learning experiences and learning processes and their future. There's very little forward planning. There's very little problem solving. We keep looking back for answers, and in doing so, we can spend years, which is actually what happens in analysis. We can spend years explaining daily events by going back to a template that's rooted in the past, by relying on information from the past. So a lot of the clients, a lot of analytical or psychoanalysis clients or patients that come to me for therapy are like, it's nice. I think I got a lot out of it, but there's no end in sight. So the reason I'm calling you is because I've just had it kind of enough. I want a way forward. I want some solutions here. I want some coping strategies.
Well, so give me all right, but don't avoid my question. Give me how much percentage of the session do you think is spent
I,
focused on the
I am
past,
avoiding your
the
question
present,
because
yeah, the present moment, kind of what's going on now and immediate problems, as opposed to considering future, more short but maybe medium and long term and life goals? Because there's quite a big difference, really. I can think, for example, I would say Ellis's REBT is actually very present moment focused. It doesn't get too far out in the future and doesn't focus too much in the past. It's kind of like, well, what are you saying to yourself right now and how you're shoulding and musting? And we change that
Mhm.
now and your current immediate challenges. Just by way, I'd say, maybe that's 70% present focused.
Yeah. I would agree with that. The cognitive behavioral therapies, all methods that come under within that spectrum, are much more rooted in the here and now and focused on the future than on the past. Maybe 20-25% on the past, if uh, it- whereas psychoanalysis, or other, let's just say other types of psychotherapy, are more the other way around. There's far too much reliance on the attachment theory, the one we just described earlier. There's far too much reliance on uh, stuff that has gone wrong in the past. Not that that's not relevant. That needs to be processed and integrated. And again, we need to do something with it in order to move on. Even when we process a narrative, a traumatic narrative from the past, the intention and the purpose is to move on, to do something with it that would be helpful today, and plan an appropriate future. That's couldn't be more forward thinking and focused than than the past. So it's about leaving the past behind and focusing on the future, on your potential.
Any
I,
particular
I think
approaches
that's
that
what all psychotherapies should be about, really. What's involved in that process? And why do we need to do this? Okay, maybe it's important to us this. Well, we know enough about psychopathology today, about mental illness, about mental disorders. And we know that those mental disorders, any kind of condition you suffer from, is characterized by a few things. Cognitive rigidity. So your thinking is stuck, is very rigid. You have a very fixated, obsessive thinking, almost obsessive, if you like, narrow view about the self, about the world, and about significant others that matter to you. You have a very narrow opinion about them, and it's you hold on to that at all costs. There's no other option. That's part of a range of mental disorders, a range of psychopathologies.
overall, particularly, you're describing a rigidity, essentially, which which
Rigidity.
which which when we talked about kind of our system constantly updating and learning from our experiences and environment earlier, that's in conflict with that learning ability that we
Yeah,
have as human animals, particularly
yeah,
the a rigidity. And
yeah,
I think that's a really interesting to look at psychological rigidity as opposed to we were talking earlier about flexibility and this
yeah,
idea of flexibility in the way you think, maybe in the way you feel, emotional
yeah,
flexibility. I think that's an interesting
yeah.
idea. And then the one that people always forget about is behavioral flexibility. Can we talk
Absolutely.
a bit about that and how that might relate to also solving problems?
Absolutely. No, let's put it down. Let's think about an example, right? A case study. So somebody that suffers from social anxiety, say they have this very rigid belief that they cannot cope with a meeting at work. They already predict before the meeting will happen. They predict how uh, uncomfortable they will feel, what a negative impact they will have on their audience, on their colleagues, how much judgment they will receive. The people might not share the judgment, but they will think it. They will judge them and so on. They will criticize them. they make all these people that suffer from social anxiety make an awful lot of predictions about the future, which is characteristic of a range of anxiety disorders. We make negative, catastrophical would be the technical term, but we make a lot of negative predictions about the future and how other people think about us, in particular with social anxiety, what they see in us. They notice how ugly I am, how terrible my voice sounds, and so on and so forth. Well, we know from hypnosis and hypnotic procedures that forward thinking is forward rehearsal. This type of, if I see myself acting in this way in the future, I'm much more likely to put it in practice. So I'm setting myself up through a suggestion. I'm hypnotizing myself. You see? That's why Hypno-CBT makes so much sense. And hypnosis has always belonged alongside the world of cognitive behavioral therapy because images are so powerful. They lead us into very specific actions and behaviors. So I'm now going to get to the behavioral parts. So what am I going to do? Because I've already thought about it so intensively, overwhelmed with anxiety and anxious feelings and fear on the day. That's the only repertoire, behavioral set of responses that I have planned for the day. And therefore, I have no plan to be optimistic, to feel strong, to feel confident, to have a powerful voice, to come across as a relaxed, confident, assertive manager. No, I have planned the worst. I have seen myself and rehearsed time and time again, because that's what these negative ruminations are, to use another technical word. These projections into the future. I've kept on rehearsing those. And therefore, on the day, I don't have an option. My behavior is going to be exactly what I rehearsed in my mind. So I prepared myself for being anxious. My behavior follows all that planning at a cognitive level. So there's hypnosis there, auto suggestions. Nobody understands auto suggestion better than a hypnotherapist and how powerful that can be. Because if you visualize yourself and if you see yourself as a confident person, eventually you start rehearsing that versus overthinking how bad you are, how badly you will perform. So let me repeat that, how poorly you will perform. And furthermore, I'm going to think about different ways in which I will fail. What do you think will happen on the day? Exactly that. I will fail. I will underperform because that's how I train myself. I set myself up for that.
Well, and also, thinking from a problem, the person's setting themselves up with the wrong problem. They're setting themselves up with a problem. I've got to get through this without looking like a fool. As that this is the. So how are they going to do that? As opposed to recognizing, well, wait a minute, that's not really the problem I want to be trying to solve. The problem I want to solve is how to give a great presentation and speak from my heart.
Yeah.
So that kind of, and I think that it's interesting if we think about, I mean, the flexibility, not just to change your thought, but to step back and change your whole orientation towards it and recognize the whole thing is off here, the way I'm relating to it, which speaks to quite a high level of flexibility, doesn't it? In someone's ability to go, wait a minute, I'm not happy with this. Let me figure out what needs to change. Not that I need to now look perfect in front of people. That's not a solution.
Yeah. And you see, it's common sense. I do not understand the criticism other schools of thought raise, the concerns that they raise about cognitive behavioral therapy practices. Sometimes, I mean, I think some of the critics and criticism is very dated now, and they've started to get the picture that cognitive behavioral therapy is a valid, it's the most relevant type of psychotherapy. It's definitely the psychotherapy of this century, and probably it will remain so for some time in the future. And the evidence is in the fact that other schools of thought, such as psychoanalysis, such as we have integrative psychotherapy, they're trying to catch up to CBT. They're borrowing methods from CBT, they're learning from CBT, and they're trying to, unfortunately, they make themselves sound too much like CBT. I mean, some processes and some tools used in psychoanalysis these days are very, very similar to what we see in a cognitive behavioral therapy session. Yeah, very similar.
Yeah, it's interesting. I can see that going on as well. But let's talk about this as you mentioned about this idea of the person becoming their own therapist. Now that strikes me as something quite different from a lot of the schools of therapy, as a very explicit and possibly, would I be wrong in saying maybe it's a kind of nearly a primary aim in CBT, whereas this doesn't seem to be. I can't imagine a psychoanalyst saying, I want my clients to become their own psychoanalyst and have their own internal transference and counter. I mean, it seems
it's impossible. It's not in line with the modalities.
Yeah,
I mean, it's scope and way of operating. I think we have to remember that the cognitive behavioral therapy has evolved in the 60s. It has been some time now. It's no longer that young, but it has so much research has gone into it in so many different domains associated with this, with the methods that we use, the treatment methods that we use in CBT. And when it comes to the client becoming their own therapist, well, that's something that a statement that has been introduced very early on by all the great names, the pioneers of cognitive behavioral therapy. Donald Mickenbaum was one of those. Beck, Ellis, I'd say those are the three main that have pioneered cognitive behavioral therapy in slightly different ways, sometimes using different examples and slightly different methods, but they're all advocated for the same thing. And because those three have promoted this type of thinking, this way of treating depression and anxieties and other neurotic disorders, other mental health problems in those earlier days, 60s and 70s, because they it's not like they were all friends and they're all operating from a university library and so on. They're all treating actively patients and researching and so on from different corners of the world almost. And they're all talking the same language. It was obvious that cognitive behavioral therapy was not going to be just one type of therapy. And this is when it exploded, right? It became just this umbrella term that's going to encompass so many different types of therapy that support the individual, but with some fundamentals there, right? With some priorities. And one of those priorities would be supporting the individual to get to a point where they are their own expert, their own therapist expert, an expert in their lives.
And what would that look like? I mean, when you say an expert, you don't mean an academic expert. You mean they have awareness and ability to what?
Well, that's just that. That's it. Awareness and ability, an awareness of different situations that trigger me, different emotions that activate me, that lead to very specific behaviors, which are quite self-destructive or self-sabotaging in nature. This connection, only the basic model in CBT, how beautiful and simple is that? If I feel right now, if I'm experiencing fear prior to this going into a meeting at work, now let's just sit on this for a moment. Let's just pause here. Let's hit the pause button, self-regulate. So there you are, emotional regulation as a tool. How do we do that? Self-hypnosis. Self-regulate. With the use of self-hypnosis, we self-regulate, we calm ourselves down. We give ourselves instructions. And then we try to make sense of what is going on. What am I predicting here? What am I scared of? Having an internal dialogue, this rationale, self-to-self dialogue, almost a dialogue between my wise mind and my emotional mind, who's always freaking out and driving me nuts. But my wise mind is also there to question. What's going on? What is it that you think you're predicting? What is it that you think is going to happen? What do you think is going to go wrong? Oh, well, you keep telling yourself, and the emotional mind can say, well, you're going to fail. You're going to perform poorly here. Things are going to go, you're going to lose your job. And then I need to be able to rationalize that, unpack that by asking myself a few basic Socratic questions. What evidence do you have? My rational mind kicks in and says, what evidence do you, my emotional mind, do you have in favor of this conclusion?
So by Socratic questioning, we're going to be Socrates now, a
yeah,
philosopher.
Yeah, I'm my own philosopher.
Who just asked, all he did was ask questions, essentially.
And you know, the only problem with that is that I might not need a therapist in the future. Definitely not going to need psychoanalysis.
And maybe you've got a bit further, but I want to kind of step back and go, so you're saying you're anxious before you go into a situation. Now, pause, relax a little bit with self-hypnosis or breathing, self-regulate, not to make yourself feel calmer to enter the situation, but to actually then be able to step back and kind of notice. And it's quite interesting. You talked about kind of what my neurotic mind is saying, which means people are kind of becoming curious and perspective taking on their own.
Yeah.
It's not me, what I'm saying. It's like this bit over here is this neurotic mind. So it's changing. Just even that exercise is actually changing their relationship with their thoughts so that they can step back and observe them and then have a dialogue between themselves about, well, is that really true? And
absolutely.
I mean, it's a little bit like, I mean, we're all aware of children, as children are aware, you know, of kind of having the devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other. You know, that's one of those kind of cartoon things.
Yeah,
but in a way, that's kind of a little bit what you're saying. But it's not a devil on this shoulder. It's kind of your neurotic, fearful mind on this shoulder, and your wise, calm, questioning, compassionate, questioning mind on the other. Yeah, and they're having a chat.
Absolutely. And they need to come to a healthier conclusion. They need to learn to evaluate the evidence for and against appropriately and accurately in line with the individual's values and prospects and plans, right? So again, constantly forward looking. I'm about to go into a meeting. How helpful it is for me to criticize right now, to engage into sort of with my self-blaming, self-critical attitude, switch that on. How helpful is that? Is it possible? Is there any evidence that I've also performed really well in similar situations in the past? What would my best friend advise me to do? What would someone that I really do? What would my therapist tell me to do?
But these would be the questions that, as the therapist, we'd be asking. But then we want the client to transfer this questioning into themselves, into the situation. So they're asking themselves the questions we'd ask in the therapy room in the situation.
They take all these tools with them out there in the real world, and they keep on rehearsing, and they live their life differently. Every day getting closer to that. And there are other tools as well, of course. I mean, we talk about behaviors, right? So we need to write down our goals, and we need to break it down. We need to learn to break down our goals into manageable steps, into smart planning, right? I know it's a bit of a cliche right now, but I still talk to people about smart planning, and everybody's like, I had a lot of training in that at work, you know, especially those that are into sort of business and so on. Who doesn't know what smart planning means, right? It's specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timed. Okay, and then my next question is, if you're so familiar with SMART, give me one example of a situation that you handled where you put it when you put it to work, and you've enjoyed its benefits, the benefits of smart planning. And they're like, no, I just know of it, but I don't really use it. Okay, well, See what I mean? Rehearse, rehearse, rehearse. Let's put it into practice. No point in knowing stuff. And this is one of the problems you see with other schools of psychotherapy. There's no point having a good. It's not that there's no point. I'm being cruel right now and maybe unfair. Of course, it's helpful to have a positive engagement and a healthy bond with another human therapist that's going to listen to you, not judge you, and never criticize you, and hold you quite literally with all your pains and vulnerability. But that's for 1 hour a week. What happens to all these other hours during the week? That's the problem. That's where CBT excels. We're bringing that positive experience. We're learning in therapy. We're discovering new methods, new coping strategies that will help you with your goals in your everyday life, every day, tomorrow. It's not about you and me, our relationship today. Sure, that needs to be in peak form, but it is about how am I going to apply myself tomorrow? What am I going to take from here today that I can put in practice tomorrow? Whether it's more, making more goals, writing things down, analyzing my own thoughts on paper.
So, I mean, in one way, we could say many of these therapies focus nearly entirely on the development of the therapeutic relationship as the process of change. But in cognitive behavioral psychotherapies, we're in a way leveraging the therapeutic relationship to get clients to take on new ways of thinking and behaving.
Yeah, but we're not taking advantage of our clients. We're not manipulating them. We're saying, you and I are a team, and we're going to do this together. I'm, metaphorically speaking, I'm going to hold your hand during this process. But my goal for you is to eventually let you go and flourish, develop, and grow on your own. To begin with, I'll be there for you. But then my support will gradually withdraw and more and more and more until you become more and more independent. It's an effort. That's what we aim. My aim is not to keep you in therapy for 5 years. And that's where you, as a client, becoming your own therapist and your own an expert in your own life problems. That's sure. And things are going to go wrong again, but they can come for a booster session, for a reminder. We forget things. We come and refresh, but we're not really into business of offering years and years of psychotherapeutic support.
And what do you, I know what your view is on this, but maybe, because I find it quite hard, this idea of engaging in what ends up being long-term therapy that does not have goals and is not time limited. So, I remember, Judith Beck said, CBT is goal focused and time limited.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, because I'm looking at people talking in the news now about regulating psychotherapy, and that would include many models that do not have goals, are not set out with clients. In fact, they deliberately avoid nearly setting goals, and they're not time limited. What do you think about that? Do you think that's a problem, or do you think there's some advantage to having no goals and no time limit?
I think research has shown time and time again that humans cannot function without purpose. And I know this is philosophical, and again, the Stoics have told us, have drilled this into us, through their knowledge and wisdom and stories at the time. And it's not just the Stoics, but other philosophers as well. We cannot function without purpose. But here's what's interesting about, and I know this is more my bag because I've developed this model, as you know, neuroaffective CBT, and I'm not going to dive into that because it's just another type of CBT therapy, very much inspired by Hypno-CBT and very much aligned to the Hypno-CBT thinking. But there's an element of science here that's worth noting. We have three, to simplify something very complex. we have three basic emotional regulation systems. One is the threat system, all essential to our survival, right? One is the threat system that relies much more on adrenaline and norepinephrine. So this combination between adrenaline and cortisol, stress hormones and so on. That's the threat system. We have another system that's called the opposite of it, the calm system. So when we're not under threat, we need to be calm. We don't have an off button for threat, for when we experience fear. But the off button, it's a process, and it's called calm, being calm. So that the calm, it's the other system, which is much more based on opiates and that we produce naturally, not externally. And we're not advocating any drug taking here. So opiates and serotonin and so on. So that's the threat system, the calm system. And then there's another one that's to do, so equally essential to our survival. Its purpose is, it's called the drive system in neuroscience, the drive system. It's the motivational system. That's the dopamine-based system. That's the hunter's mode, the excitement. How did we invent the wheel? How did we discover that fire cooks food and the meat tastes better? Because we don't have big fangs and huge claws. We cannot tear into another animal and eat its meat. It also makes us quite unhealthy if we were to do that. Even tens of thousands of years ago, we didn't quite have that type of digestive system. So, and the required tools we needed something else. It's the drive system. It's the motivation, the curiosity that drives us forward, the invention, the creativity. The creativity is not necessarily rooted into the threat system, maybe a little bit into the calm system, but they all, if imagine those three systems, we have three circles. They come together into a triangle, they meet in the middle. They all have some common ground, right? They all need to overlap. They need to coexist in a beautiful triangle, which is our whole organism, if you like, from a neuroaffective viewpoint, from a neuroscientific, from a neurobiological viewpoint. So we've got to have an equilibrium within our lives and system of desire and motivation and purpose, and in other words, goals. We have it's something else there. I just read a message that distracted me. No, it's not that. I'm sorry to disagree with that. That's also part of it somehow, but I'm not talking about the infrastructure, the human infrastructure as such. I'm talking about more about the hormones that are required for, yes, they are traveling through a very complex network and very complex and well put together, well designed infrastructure. We're not talking about that, but these, if you like, systems are essential for our survival and equilibrium. And we cannot always be under threat or feel nervous, because that means we would only overproduce cortisol and adrenaline until we collapse. We cannot lack motivation too much in purpose, because then we produce to very little dopamine, and that goes against us. We have no pleasure in life, and then eventually we collapse. And we cannot be too calm all the time. From time to time, we need to be on edge and purposeful, driven. So my point is this: how does that translate to real life? Well, we've got to have an intention. We've got to have a purpose. We are goal-oriented mammals. And even other mammals that we have looked at animal behavior studies, and we know other mammals, they all have purpose. Their purpose is to look after each other and to survive, ultimately. Our organism, our brain in charge of the rest of the organism, it's well-intended. It's doing the same thing. And it relies on this internal infrastructure to achieve that. But to come back, I know it's a very complex issues, and we can talk about this for hours, and we need a whole new workshops about neuroscience and neuroaffective research. And some people have heard maybe too much about the polyvagal theories and all this other stuff. This isn't that. This isn't that at all. This is just very, in fact, some methods that are called compassion focused therapy, mindfulness based cognitive therapy. All this, what we in our world we call this the third wave of cognitive behavioral therapy, the latest generation of CBT. They all looked into these aspects because we need to understand what motivates us. Well, what pushes our dopamines up, keeps us motivated and interested? Goals and rewards, right? So behaviors, conditioning, rewards, and all the conditioning theories, learning is involved in that, right?
So I'm trying to now bring that back around to the question here, in terms of having getting into therapy where there are no defined goals and that's going on for a long time. And I'm sure those models have some reason and explanation for that, but I'm hearing you say that, but there needs to be purpose within this kind of work that we're doing together, or this meeting that we're doing together in therapy. And
I think human beings cannot exist, frankly, cannot survive without purpose and goals. And that's been demonstrated and through various types of research into major depressive MDD, major depressive disorder, and suicide. People that commit suicide, they have no purpose. They see themselves as having no purpose, no future. They have no goals. So there's a direct correlation there.
So what's happening then in long-term therapy where there aren't particularly set goals? Are you saying that there's sort of a kind of an unstated goal, that it's something to do with the therapy that's going on here becomes the goal? Or, I mean, what I'm trying to understand
yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting question. I'd love to sit at a panel one day with other types of because otherwise it's a little bit one-sided, of course, and I might sound as being very opinionated. I just think there's science and a lot of data behind what I'm saying, that we need to have purpose, and we need to be goal-oriented. Otherwise, we quite literally die. We end up feeling depressed and suicidal, lacking motivation, not producing enough dopamine is bad for the system. When I said that those three systems need to coexist and meet in the middle somehow and achieve a beautiful triangle almost, I didn't mean that a triangle doesn't have unequal laterals, right? So you cannot have too much of a thread system. If we imagine the three circles getting together, a huge thread system, when you're overwhelmed by the likes of cortisol and adrenaline, and then you have too little motivation and too little calm response, too little opiates.
Yeah, I guess I'm just trying to understand kind of, I have trouble, which I think you are a little bit as well, in kind of trying to understand how one can have kind of a therapy that's going on long term. We may be talking 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 sessions or more, that doesn't have explicit stated goals. So
I think that becomes tough. I personally, I don't have trouble understanding that. I'm a bit wary, and I don't want to sound too critical of other schools of thought, which you know very well that I can be. I'm very vocal about that. I don't hold back, in other words. And I've learned in the more recent years that sometimes it's good to exercise some restraint as well. But I don't want to be too critical. But the reality is that becomes something else. It's a type of support. It becomes a support system, kind of an addiction, a reliance. But then is it healthy? It's healthy if the individual feels it's healthy, right? But without purpose, without goals, without learning to become your own therapist and be independent, by definition, you become the opposite, dependent on your therapist. In my world, the world of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a problem-solving, goal-oriented process, that's not healthy. And also, it has been shown that's not viewed as treatment. It does not treat psychopathology, that does not treat mental illness.
Mm.
You know, if anything, it can aggravate the problem.
Well, so let's talk about that. Let's go into the issue of harm in psychotherapy for a moment, and because actually somebody I want to interview quite soon is Professor Lawrence Petitis at Portsmouth University, and his particular area we've been tweeting together really is iatrogenic harm in psychotherapy, and he published something recently showing that your emotional memories about your parents can be changed even in a single psychotherapy session. Certainly over a
I
few
actually agree
psychotherapy
with that.
sessions.
Yeah.
I think I showed that. So let's talk about what are the potentials for harm in psychotherapy, and let's not shy away also from saying what might be some of the potentials for harm in even a cognitive behavioral approach.
Yeah, yeah. So there's always the potential to harm people through psychotherapy in general, not just the cognitive behavioral therapy, any other school of thought. It is the timing. This is where you need supervision. This is where you need good training, evidence-based training. You need to understand the science behind the method. And
why do you need to understand the science behind the method?
Well, I think it's a little bit like let's look at the conditioning theory, right? Years and years of research have gone into it, and we know that conditioning theories and learning theories, social learning theories, are at the core of exposure methods. What does exposure mean? Exposure means this in simple terms. I'm afraid of dogs. Why am I afraid of dogs? Is that relevant? Maybe. I was bitten by a dog when I was young. And being that little, and the dog being kind of almost as tall as me, that frightened the hell out of me when I was 6. So it is a traumatic stress. I wouldn't necessarily label it as a trauma, but it's a traumatic stress. So what happens as a result of that? I am afraid of all dogs I come across, and then I get older. Remember, I become more and more rigid, cognitively rigid and behaviorally rigid, because my memories are not upgraded. My values, my opinion, assumption about my assertion about myself and about the world I come in contact with is not upgraded, because I rigidly hold on to that belief, which is a safety belief.
And because you're not having new experiences, or you're not letting new information come in.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm not learning, in other words. And because I'm avoiding, that's how I don't learn. I avoid contact with all dogs at all costs. Therefore, I do not learn. I don't open myself to new experiences.
Then it's just looping around within your head, yeah?
Exactly. So then I grow up with this very rigid belief that all dogs are very, very dangerous. So as a young adult, maybe I avoid parks where there might be dogs. I mean, I don't know a park in London or anywhere in this world where there's not going to be a dog. I mean, come on, you know. So, but there are people that are like that. I've treated people for pigeon phobia, for dog phobia, for all sorts of animal phobias, right?
Not just and let's just say, when we say belief, I think people can take that as being sort of some explicit, obvious belief, but it can be. I always remember Donald Robertson, when I trained with him, saying, imagine a cat is sitting outside a mouse hole. Are we saying it has, and it's waiting patiently, does it have the belief that there is a mouse in there? So I was like, well, that's a really good question, you know. But yeah. I mean, when we say belief, we don't just mean a kind of surface level thought, do we? We mean actually something much more, don't we?
Yeah. We mean all types of, we simplify it for training purposes so that it makes sense to people. And then we go deeper and deeper into those theories, but we've got to introduce them gradually. In fact, it's not just belief. It could be just an image. It's just my imagination. I'm imagining that there's a dog in that park, and that's why I'm not going to go in that park, even though there's a beautiful girl I might be dating today there, and she invited me to this park. I'm not going to go there because I'm terrified of dogs.
And that could be quite subliminal. I mean, liminal. Yeah, I don't like the word subliminal, but we could barely be aware of these sorts of negative,
they're just
fearful
so
images.
Habitual and so automatic. It's just, but again, and going back to that neuroaffective model, it's flaring up the other system. I'm relying too much on my threat system, which inhibits my desire, my motivation to go out into the park. It inhibits. See, too many hormones from one system can inhibit all the others. So we need to disinhibit it and create more hormones. How do we create motivation? Learning, being curious, being interested, laughing it off. So
imagining other possibilities in the park.
Yeah, through our imagination, because I'm imagining a threat. I'm imagining an alternative, something healthier, something more positive. Imagine that I can cope. Imagine that one of those that actually look at myself in the mirror and draw a picture of a dog or get a puppy or a toy. I often do this with people that are terrified of an animal as such. We buy it as realistic toy animal as possible, and they look at each other in the mirror. And here I am, I'm 5 foot or 6 foot or whatever, and there's this little thing. The difference is size is pretty, what do I think about that? How can I do with that? What if I started communicating with this cute little thing? What if I start seeing it as a cute little thing rather than a dangerous little thing? What if I start imagining all those things or actually rehearsing that in real life and this is the real life exposure.
Maybe the owner of that little dog is actually a very attractive woman or man that you might want to talk to.
Yeah, exactly. A very interesting person that you might want to know. So there are a lot of possibilities there, which I cannot access because of this psychological rigidity that I'm experiencing due to mental illness, due to a phobic response, a phobic type anxiety. So the way to think about exposure is that I'm gradually learning how to cope and that I can cope. There are two aspects of learning here. That I can cope, I am more able than I think I am, and then how to cope with the threat should the threat occur. Well, I can also think of worst case scenarios. Well, I'm bigger now, I'm taller, I can run faster. I can pick a piece of wood and throw it back, fight back. Or I can maybe learn to read dogs, and if they, move their tail in a certain way, that's a sign of playfulness. And if versus what does an aggressive dog look like, sound like, so on and so forth. So it's all through learning. It's a learning process and gradually exposing myself to this threat that I will.
So we got into this because you were saying people need to understand, the scientific kind of theory or principles behind the method in a way to not engage in harm with a client. So let's come back round to that and see. So this understanding of principles and theory then is a way in which we can really be helping our clients better and avoid. I mean, let's talk about the harms that could be there if people don't understand, perhaps.
If they don't understand the
scientific theory, that's what you were saying. People need to be able to. How can we? Yeah.
I think what I often see with on these doctoral programs that people come to specialize in psychopathology and in treatment and cognitive behavioral therapy is a lack of effort to explain the science and the theories behind it, the rationale behind a technique, the lack of use of psychoeducation. And again, this is called psychoeducation, psychological education. It has many different shapes and forms, psychological education, but one of the domain that it covers is the theory behind a concept. And we're trying to explain people, maybe the model I used earlier with the 3 emotional regulation systems is a bit too complex. It's not for everyone. Maybe that's appropriate to someone that I might want to introduce to relaxation, the benefit of relaxation exercises. Because I'm like, if I was to draw this in session, I'll make the threat system a red circle, really, really big. I'll make the motivational system blue, half as big as the red circle, smaller, and a green P will be the calm system. I don't know how to calm, how to relax, how to relax my muscles, how to progressively unwind and switch off from a threat. So that will be very, so, using these visuals, am I like, we need to develop some techniques that will help you enhance this tiny green pea is unfairly treated here, and it's going to disappear. Over time, you're going to lose the ability to actually relax. And without learning how to self-regulate and down-regulate from a state of tension or hyperarousal, down-regulate, then you don't know, you don't have access to decision-making, to learning. Because when you're tense and scared, we cannot learn.
So I'm hearing a couple of things here. I'm hearing you saying, the therapist needs to be able to communicate this and creatively, because also you indicated there, I might not use that 3 model approach here with somebody else. But with this person, I might use it. So there's some
or I might use it with drawings to make it clear.
But then, and a creativity in the way you present this particular theoretical model for the benefit of the client being really understanding the meaning,
exercises, self-hypnosis.
Why they're going to do it, but also this other aspect of them taking away and becoming their own. How can they become their own therapist if they don't really understand the theory?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's bingo. That's the connection.
It's quite an enterprise, really, isn't it?
It's an investment. I really need to sell you the concept of the benefits of being calmer, learning to relax, learning to self-regulate better.
So that's quite a scope as the therapist that you're taking on here in terms of seeing what's happening, where is the stuckness, what needs to change. Now let's introduce a model here that is going to be helpful, present it creatively, and ensure there's a kind of the client doesn't just get what they need to do, but why to do it and how to maybe figure things out if it's not work, be able to problem solve around it as well.
And I need to explain it to you so well and break it down in terms that will make sense to you. Whatever model it is I rely on. I just so happen to choose a very complex one today. I hope I'm not upsetting people, and I hope I'm not flaring up their imagination. This is not, again, let me just re-emphasize this. This is not polyvagal theories, none of that stuff that is not rooted in evidence. So it's very simple, psychoeducation, because I need to explain it to you so well so that you can explain it to your friends if need be. Not just explain it, use it on yourself, but even help others with it. So that's really unique to cognitive behavioral therapy that I know of. I know other modalities have started adopting a lot of goal-oriented processes, a little bit of exposure. Exposure is typical, rooted in social learning theories and conditioning theories. The old Pavlovian stuff with a dog. If I ring the bell, the bell would be, providing that I associate it with food, the dog will instantly salivate, and so on and so forth. And then if I stop ringing the bell, the dog desensitizes. He thinks there's no food. Or if I ring the bell without the food, then the dog will come eagerly towards the food. But after 2 or 3 rings, he learns, he's desensitizing. He learns that the food is no longer there, and therefore he's no longer going to approach it. When we put this into practice through a variety of different experiments, it turns out that it's something as simple as, the bell could be in a creative program, in a creative exposure behavioral experiment, could be, the bell is the reward associated with the reward in the park, like a date or meeting, like you suggested earlier, meeting someone that you wanted to meet for a long time, getting to know your neighbor that you admired for a long time, you wanted to speak with him, but they so happen they have a dog. Perhaps the reward, the bell and so on, the reward in itself is greater than the threat. And if we learn to overcome that and respond to the bell, maybe there will, there's something there to learn. There's something there to experience that's different than just fear. So there are all sorts of associations that we learn to make, and this kind of what we call behavioral experiments in the world of CBT that lead to creative coping strategies. People always come to training and say, oh, there are set coping strategies and coping. There are, yes. But the biggest tool of all is your own creativity as a therapist, and your clients' knowledge and understanding of their lives. Because yes, at the end of the day, they understand their stories and their lives and their circumstances. They know it a lot better than you do. You're an expert in cognitive behavioral therapy, and to a degree in some mental health problems. You're an expert in those areas, but they're an expert in their life. So that combination is lethal. It gets the job done.
Nice. Two experts coming together. Very nice. So let's dive into some tricky questions that I put up earlier, and then I want to wrap up by having you talk a little bit about your experience, and we'll do that later in a minute, in terms of the diploma in cognitive behavioral hypnotherapy, because you have, I mean, you've consulted for us on it now, but you've actually been through it yourself as well. You teach a postgraduate course at Regent's University on CBT. You're extremely experienced in the area. So first we're going to throw some challenging questions at you, then come back and have a look at your views on the diploma and this idea of integrative CBT. But let's not go there yet. Let's first of all ask a few challenging questions. And I drew some of these up earlier, and I put them in front of Daniel. He was like, oh, wow, those are some pretty good questions. So one question here is, CBT is often criticized for being a quick fix that glosses over deeper underlying issues in a person's life. Do you think CBT can really lead to lasting change, or is it just teaching people to cope without truly resolving their problems?
So that's a classical question, and that's a very interesting question. So is CBT a quick fix? There are lots of different layers here, and then does it gloss over deeper underlying issues in person's life? I think everything that we talked about this evening supports the opposite of that. CBT is not a quick fix. We don't just, we don't need years, but that doesn't mean we're quick. This doesn't take minutes. This takes hours and hours of training and study for us to get to a level where we can implement some tools that will help our clients. And we need to be able to learn to understand their narratives and their stories and help them move on. So it's not a quick fix. There's no such thing as a quick fix. Now, it's not years. So if by quick fix we mean a few hours of therapy or weeks, a few weeks of therapy, rather than years, then okay, it's quick fix. But it's not an hour or two.
I think people are maybe suggesting that, teaching somebody this coping technique and a way of challenging their thoughts, and then there you are, there's a CBT form, use that. But is that, I mean, my view might be that in some ways we will go for some, if there are a few quick fixes out there, we'll go for them as a way to build the relationship confidence, but also to start to develop, well, look, see, some of this can work. Now let's start to leverage that.
Yes, and in terms, like I said, there are many layers to this very interesting question. And one other aspect is once people learn to cope, again, there's a lot of data on this. We need to go, but this is where research is so important. We know that once something has been learned and rehearsed, we cannot unlearn it. Not immediately anyway. It's we learning requires rehearsal. So we know how to teach and how to help people learn through repetition, through rehearsal at a cognitive level and a behavioral level, as in they rehearse in their mind. They also write things down. They read. They act in specific ways. There are lots of different. So through repetition and conditioning, people learn. And once they've learned something, they can't just unlearn it, right? It's not as simple as that. So, and also, when individuals suffer from a mental health problem, they're stuck there. Once they offered a solution out of pain, out of an emotional episode, why would you not access that when the solution is there? It's so this thing with, is it long lasting? Of course it's long lasting. You just keep on reinventing yourself. You keep on rehearsing. You keep on trying. You learn to take new risks, calculated risks, not random. You learn to think in a different way. You almost, I don't like the word reprogram, but in a way you kind of reprogram your mind and your body to think and act differently in a variety of different situations. And that's just what CBT does. Is that long lasting? I mean, well, the evidence is quite clear that, look, there are conditions, mental health problems that sometimes would develop or evolve, or those are there's medication sometimes needed in parallel with cognitive behavioral therapy. But
I mean, there's perhaps an idea within this that might say, look, if you teach people to cope with all the problems they're facing and even achieve their short, medium, long-term goals, you're still not really getting, you've just teach, you have not really getting into the deep issues. And part of me is going to go, well, but what's that left then? I mean, they're coping with their life, they're coping with their challenges, they're achieving what they wanted in life. We haven't gone and talked about all this other stuff in therapy, but why do we need to? I think there's just this sense that maybe even though you're helping people cope and achieve things here, you haven't gone into the deep stuff in therapy.
In my view, it depends on the problem as well. I mean, there are we wouldn't just install a set of coping strategies at the expense of the past. We're not just going to disregard and ignore the past if the past is worth paying attention to, but often it isn't. Let's just, quite often there's the individuals, a lot of us are guilty of this, interpreted our environment. It's how we read the environment at a particular stage in our lives. Maybe at the time our parents didn't buy us the favorite toy, or they were a bit more restrictive, more guided by rules that today would be regarded as dated. Whatever their reasons were, however I interpreted that relationship and those engagements and that parenting model would have impacted on me to a degree. But sometimes it's enough to just say that in therapy. Exactly what I just told you now. And that takes about 5 minutes.
Well, I think that's it. Interesting. Properly assigning blame to the past, but then getting on with and recognizing the maladaptation, and then moving forward.
It's like whatever it happened.
Yeah.
There's a reason why it happened. I call this the story behind the story. There's a story behind. Your parents also have a story to tell. There's a story behind, your story. It's your parents' story, right? They didn't know any better. That's how they were raised. They had certain rules. They passed on those rules on to you. They're no longer applicable to today, 2024. Fine. But let's not forget, this is 2024. And everything that we talk about right now would have happened 15, 20, 30 years ago. So let's just focus. Wouldn't it be, can we accept that and perhaps focus on 2024 and 2025? If anything, it's how helpful is it for you to be stuck? Because for as long as you're stuck in the past, you're not going to be forward looking. You cannot do both.
Okay, good. I've got another one here that I think you'll like. Critics argue that CBT's focus on changing faulty thoughts can come across as invalidating, essentially telling people their feelings are wrong. How do you ensure that clients feel fully heard and validated rather than feeling like their emotional reality is being dismissed as irrational?
Yeah. So there's some truth in the fact that the jargon, the training jargon used in cognitive behavioral therapy can be a bit harsh. We use language such as irrational, but it isn't necessarily translatable to the client. It doesn't need to be used. Some clients will respond to that language, and some would feel a little bit put off by it, at the very least. There's a lot of truth in it. But this is where we go back on to the relationship and the therapeutic alliance. We have a name for this in CBT called therapeutic alliance. We need to have a strong therapeutic alliance, an empathic alliance, a healthy bond that will promote honesty and open dialogue. We did not use strategies such as transference and countertransference to teach because there's no evidence that this works. So in other words, I'm going to rely on the fact that somehow you will learn from me. Say we are in a relationship and you make an inappropriate comment about yourself, and that makes you very angry, and you become depressed and sad in that moment. Sadness overwhelms you because, you know, I'm terrible at this. This is how I messed up this week. I've been horrible to this person at work. I cannot live with myself. And my response to that would be silence. Empathic, maintaining eye contact, nodding with a lot of empathy. It's one response. And I would hope that you would somehow pick up on that empathy and compassion and employ it yourself, apply it yourself. Will it be nice if that could work? And sometimes maybe it does. But it's better if, on top of all of that, just being there, I might come and forward and ask you, well, can you tell me more about it? What are the circumstances leading up to that? You and I know that you're quite critical of yourself, but you also quite often jump into conclusions. So we're not going to tell the client that he's irrational and he's relying on all these mental filters that are called cognitive distortions, maximizing the failures, minimizing their successes. We're not going to do that quite literally in that way, but we're going to suggest it by saying, well, you know, perhaps you can think of other occasions when you've been nice to that colleague of yours, or what is the evidence that they actually have interpreted that situation in the same way that you are right now? Could they be thinking something else? Is there an alternative to this? Was there somebody else present? What would they say? And if they weren't present, what they might say. If somebody else was present, what would they think about that situation? So we're trying to look at various alternatives and dismantle this rigidity, this rigid conclusion. Now that's being proactive and tackling a negative thought head on, rather than just. So we're doing much more work the point is this, and Dawn talks about, Donald, Dr. Mickenbaum talks about this a lot as well. If you come out of your therapy session not being tired and exhausted, you haven't done a good enough job. Because this takes a lot more work than just being compassionate and silent and displaying, but silently, that compassion. And hoping that they'll take, I'm not going to assume anything because I can't read your mind, but I'm going to project something else. Curiosity. Isn't that interesting? How about that? But it's interesting that you view it in this way, but have you considered also this other aspect? Can we think together about some other? Yeah.
How does this, because we're addressing this aspect of not invalidating the client, how does this sort of compassion, curiosity, real interest, asking questions, getting to think about it, kind of validate them and the way they're feeling? We do want to, I think, kind of in somewhat have them start to invalidate some of those thoughts that are coming up. But we don't want, but the fact how they feel is valid, and who they are is more than this narrow way they're relating to it. That's kind of what we're trying to point to.
So the point is, I think that's the other aspect about CBT. It has evolved so much. It's progressive, right? And it has, I think in the earlier days, the model has been almost too rational. It's about, and it says on the team, right, with Ellis, rational, emotive, RABT, rational. It's about being rational. But sometimes it's very difficult to be logical when you're overwhelmed with emotions. And you come to therapy with a purpose and in good intention to offload. And you quite literally vomiting all your sorrows there and your pain and so on, and you dump it on in your therapy session, rightly so. You don't invalidate that. You don't just jump at some. These are the kind of techniques that we learn. We learn to pull back. We learn to listen. We learn to validate. And then, but there's always a then in CBT. We don't assume. We ask questions. We open a dialogue. We don't just validate and accept their self-criticism, their self-blaming thoughts. We know they're very, very good at that already. We don't hold back. We're saying, I understand why you feel the way you do, but you have a responsibility, and it is within your power to move on from this, to reevaluate and see things differently. Why? Because you can, and you came to me, and you want to feel better. That's what you told me when you started this. And if that's your intention, then let's do things differently. So it's not about rejecting. It's not about invalidation. It's a slightly different approach. You see, we accept, we embrace, but we're not. It's somewhat different, I think, from the person-centered approach, where we just accept everything that's being handed over to us. Where I understand where you come from, but it doesn't matter, even if that was the reality. Even if that you confronted is, how do we move on from this? How do we move forward?
I want to kind of tie this back to something you said earlier, and maybe this is you're kind of saying, you're saying that in the early versions we might particularly focus on helping the client see quite quickly that this was irrational and that was generating their emotions. But what you're saying is, but we have clients sometimes coming in such a strong emotional state that if we start to go down that route, they just don't. They're so strong in this, and so we need to then be with that, accept that, engage in a dialogue that kind of actually starts to bring them down, and from there they can start to take this more kind of now rational kind of curiosity approach about what's happening, which is exactly what you said earlier about the going into the public speaking and then taking a calming breath,
a moment,
to calm down, and then to talk to yourself about your neurotic mind and wise mind. So this same principle, we can't engage in some of the cognitive part until we've sort of
this is the hypno bit out of CBT.
But this could be also why also sometimes with more severe cases, medication at the same time
Yeah,
is a good idea because people just are not stable enough to
yeah.
get on the
You've got
learning
to
platform.
self-regulate, and
Yeah.
then you can rationalize, you can problem solve, you just don't, again, this is, I guess, what I was saying earlier was when I introduced this more complex model of with the 3 basic emotional regulation systems. It's actually not that basic. I don't know why we call it basic, but there are many things like, labeled not quite correctly in CBT, just like irrational thinking. It is irrational thinking, but we got to think creatively about how we might want to introduce this concept of irrational thinking to our clients. For instance, mental filters is a much more popular word. So we're aware of the diminishing impact that some of the language in that CBT uses has on the client.
Mm.
And we've been aware of it for some time. Because what was fashionable in the 60s and the 70s and appropriate is no longer appropriate today, I'm afraid. We still can. I have psychiatry books from the 90s where homosexuality was a mental illness. It was.
Yeah, I mean, there's that's obvious, but I mean, in terms of also, might it be that some of the earlier development of cognitive therapy was done with a less, let's say a more middle class white population, and that as you take it out into areas where people have had more adversity, and less privilege, let's say, for example, that it has to be more adapted, it has to get a little bit more emotionally focused and accepting before we get into some of this cognitive stuff.
Yeah, but also it was a reaction to extreme psychoanalysis and extreme behaviorism. And all these 3 guys positioned themselves somewhere in the middle. They said, well, behaviorists, which we all are and we love, they don't take thinking into account. Psychoanalysts don't take cognitions into account either. So what is going on here? But let's not forget that all these 3 guys, all these pioneers, they were trained both in psychoanalysis and behaviorism. They were much more on the behavioral side of things, of course. But they positioned ultimately somewhere in the middle, and they said there are aspects from these methods that we could use and add to it, much more focused on. So in those earlier days, there was a need for the C, for the big C, the cognitions, a renewed focus, an introduction. It wasn't even a renewed focus. It was a brand new concept. Let's focus on cognitions. What is the role of cognitions in mental illness? It's not just thoughts, it's also images, mental images, this internal negative rehearsal and negative ruminations, worry. They started thinking and analyzing all these new concepts, this new phenomena, which was fascinating and led to so many different techniques. But it took a while. I think the criticism would be maybe slightly justified if we go back to Beck Ellis's methods in the 60s. To a degree will be justified because these guys were not saying, let's insult and invalidate our clients. Let's face it, they were experienced therapists, and they they all understood mental illness, and they understood the nature of the human the vulnerable nature of humans in general. And I think the focus on cognition is about saying, even in the 60s, was much more about you're having a thought that you're performing, you hurt your friend in that discussion, or you're having a thought that you will underperform at this meeting tomorrow. That's a thought that's generating a lot of instability within you right now, a lot of fear. And it's quite possible that this fear, if you keep on diving into this thought and repeating it and different versions of it, if you keep on catastrophizing, in other words, that will lead to more fear, which will lead to eventually to avoidance. Not going to a meeting, which will be worse for you. There will be worse consequences. You'll feel bad about it. You'll be even more self-critical. And that's what we're dealing maybe with today, the fact that you avoided that meeting. But it all started with a thought. So you're having a thought that, but what is the evidence for the thought? What is the evidence against it? So you see, they were right to target thoughts because nobody else was, quite frankly. And we're still right today, 50 odd years later, 60, 70 years later. It's right that we should target thoughts. Because the basic principle, it's still very much valid today. You are having a thought that you are underperforming. You are having a thought that you're a bad person. But what is the evidence really for that thought? Do you have any evidence against the thought itself? Does anybody else that you know has any evidence that would support the opposite? Is there, can you identify any episodes from your past, recent past, or way past earlier years where maybe you've demonstrated to yourself and people around you that you are good enough, you are valuable, you are lovable, you are the opposite of what this current thought is telling you today? What would it take for you to think differently about yourself? So you see, we can still work within these earlier methods by retaining a focus on the thought. Now, the language that we use, it has to be, of course, like everything else in CBT, upgraded, updated to this century, to 2024, 2025 soon.
Culturally adapted and individually adapted, yeah.
In line with the individual's culture and values. They've never advocated against that. And this is what this criticism is not taking into account. Nobody has ever not talked about not taking an individual's culture into account and values. Because you need to speak an individual. In order to address their thoughts and understand their thoughts, you need to understand their values and culture. It's as simple as that. One of the things I tell my students, even at the doctoral level, and you'll be surprised how other schools of thought pay very little regard to this area. So how many of you have had clients from Japan, say? What part? Okinawa. Okay, what do you know about Okinawa? Have you ever been? Did you look it up? What do you know about the culture? What do you know about the island? What do they eat? Tell me 2 or 3 things that are typical to an Okinawan Japanese individual. Blank. Doctoral programs. People that are ready to go out there and kick it. It's we do not, on the contrary, in order for us to really understand somebody's thinking, we've got to understand their culture, their values, and where they come from. And if you're not confident, don't take that referral. But if you do, make sure that you invest in it, in every single client. I think in CBT, we're a lot stronger on this, and existentialism too. Not sure that they break it down quite in these details. Because you see, everybody talks about specific themes. Psychoanalysis focuses much more on the childhood. Existentialism, acceptance, meaning of life, compassion, and so on. Person-centered therapy, unconditional regard, and non-judgmental, non-critical approach. All of that is great. All of that is fantastic. But what about the person sitting in front of you? Why do they think the way they do? Where are they coming from? They're not just the product, biological product of sex of 2 individuals 20, 30, 40 years ago. They come from a culture, from a community. What do you know about that culture and community and their values? That's what we're very good at doing within CBT.
And their relationship with that culture and those, because they may have quite an antithetical relationship with the culture.
Beck, Mickenbaum, and Ellis, the 3 main pioneers, they all advocated for one thing when it comes to thinking and cognitions: thoughts about self, right? Thoughts about significant others that I'm interacting with, and so beliefs about selves, values that I hold on to about myself, about my interactions with others, about significant others, and the world the context, the world. They call it the world, but it's actually, this is called the cognitive triad, right? But the world, they refer to the context, the world I live in, I'm part of, my prospects, my future prospects. So I'm very much interested. When we talk about beliefs, we talk about values, we talk about life assumptions, we talk about life rules, if you like, values that we hold on to, about ourselves, about the community we live in, the world we're part of, and our prospects in when we interact with significant others. I am, for instance, I am unlovable. Others that I interact with within my community are likely to take advantage of me, because that's the community I live in. If they see that you're vulnerable, they tend to take advantage of you. So others are threatening and dangerous and likely to take advantage of me if I allow them to. And the world, well, the world I live in doesn't really offer me anything. Not someone that is bad like me, fundamentally bad. So you see, beliefs about myself, I'm bad. Significant others are taking advantage of me, and then the world I live in is lacking prospects. So when we dive into an individual's thoughts and thinking, we look at all these angles constantly. We're fishing out, trying to understand. There's a lot of philosophy there. There's a lot of existentialism there, much more so than existentialists think they dive into.
Well, and also, you know, some of what I love so much about CBT is and I get to say this word, which I love to keep saying, is very phenomenologically focused. So, you know, we have a consultant we work with actually for doing some of our website learning platforms, and his company is called The Customer's Shoes. Which is great, because this idea of actually getting into, and you were speaking to this exactly now, getting into the client's shoes and understanding their world of experience, that not what happened in the past, but the world of experience as it's happening now, in terms of, and that this, I think that also the thing of this is some of that is kind of obvious to them, but some of it we have to ask a few questions and shine the light of awareness and consciousness onto these thoughts that they weren't aware they were having, but then they become aware they're having them. And I think that process as a meditator, this aspect of being present, focused with the phenomena that are arising and developing awareness of them, is just, I love it so much, because then the client can solve their problems. They have choice.
Yeah.
Now they have awareness and choice.
And I've collaborated a lot, as you know, with colleagues from the existential field and existential domain, and I love what they do, actually, pretty much everything. Very meaningful. I think it's a powerful type of psychotherapy, but even they are getting nowhere near the depth that cognitive behavioral therapy is touching. Because when we talk about phenomenology and what it means, it's the study of an individual's lived experience, or experience the way the individual exists in the world.
Moment by moment, yeah.
Yeah. That's the very definition of mindfulness in CBT. We're helping people achieve a point in their life when they're a lot more present, a lot more fluid, and they live moment to moment in non-judgmental awareness, but awareness, alert and interested and curious about life.
And all these layers that they have experienced that come in on top of that, of their own conditioning being layered on top of this, you know, in a way.
You know, open to new experiences, not being afraid. There are so many connotations there.
And in that awareness, that kind of phenomenological awareness, nearly being able to start to free themselves from their own maladaptive conditioning patterns, habits.
Yeah. Because can you truly, from an existential, this is where I have very heated conversation with my existential colleagues, but can you truly get into to understand an individual's lived experience without by being so boundaried within the confinement of a very rigid 50-minute session. We're much more fluid with our engagement. We could, one of our sessions, one of our social experiments or behavioral experiments could take part in the real world or an individual's home if appropriate and safe.
I think people don't realize that about CBT. I mean, when Donald was getting into it, Donald Robertson, and I would go to Harley Street and I'd go out and have lunch in John Lewis or something, I'd nearly always bump into him in the street with a client, and he was out there doing behavioral experiments with it, and he wouldn't want me to talk. You know, they'd be going in the lift or the escalators or crossing the road or something, and he's out there with the client doing therapy in the real world as the client's experiencing it, not in the therapy room at a distance.
No, this is what I mean. A lot of if I always give this example, right, as real case studies in my lectures. I can think right away of two extreme cases where a guy suffering from panic disorder and agoraphobia has not come out of his home. It was the most extreme case I've ever treated of agoraphobia. 11 years he didn't come out of his house. 11 years. Obviously, and this was pre-virtual therapy, right? So we didn't, I think it was Skype, but people were not used to Skype yet, and so on and so forth. It wasn't a concept that was relied upon, virtual engagement. So obviously, but even if he was, to be honest, the assessment would have, and the first few sessions of therapy, which involved assessing him, understanding his type of avoidance, agreeing together on an exposure plan. It involved me literally going to his home and gradually accompanying him very, very slowly out of his home, and teaching him self-regulation tools and how to rehearse a different possibility and a variety of different coping strategies. And, you know, at first we walked into the front garden. In the end, we walked onto the pavement, and then we came back, and then the next few sessions took place in a local coffee shop, and then he took a plane to meet his virtual girlfriend in LA, which was actually the reason why he came to therapy in the first place. He met somebody sort of during a forum or online or something, but they only knew each other via the phone or Skype or something like that, whatever the technology was available at the time. I can't remember, but the idea is that Fred really wanted to meet face to face, and he was like, I need to travel. What am I going to do? I've not stepped foot outside of the home for 11 years. So if you think of the three basic emotional regulations, I was onto a winner right away because the motivation was there, the purpose, right? See what I mean about the purpose? And the goal was there. So I'm like, oh, great. I don't have to agree with you and sell you a set of goals. You've got a goal already. Let's start working towards that goal right away, right? So
because I think, you know, agoraphobia, where you can't get your handle, can't get a really good goal there, it's problematic.
Yeah, it's problematic, but then you have to get creative and come up with stuff. But the point is, the assessment at the very least and the first few hours of therapy would have to take place in his home. Nowadays, it's a lot easier because maybe you start doing some things online and then watch some things together and then gradually meet. Eventually, you still get out of the office and you still meet with the client. We come back to the concept of phenomenology. You enter, quite literally enter the client's own world. That doesn't happen in any other type of psychotherapy. It's frowned upon, it's risky, it's not safe, it's breaking every single boundary, therapeutic boundary that a lot of other schools of thought rely on so heavily still in 2024. It's not practical. It's gonna have to change, and I believe it will change.
How many sessions before you managed to get him to start coming out of the house a bit?
I still have his case now somewhere because I'm using it as a case study, but I think it wasn't a lot. It was the assessment plus a couple of hours or so. So but within 2-3 hours, he was out of the house.
Wow. That's
So an
impressive.
hour of psychoeducation, self-regulation, progressive muscle relaxation. To cut a long story short, a lot of psychoeducation and self-regulation too. A lot,
Mm,
a lot, a lot,
mm.
a lot of psychoeducation.
On avoid on understanding. I mean,
Yeah, this
presumably
is
this is
fear.
panic attack based. Yeah.
Exactly. This is how fear, this is the cycle of fear. This is how you feel. This is kind of you. This is what happens with your blood pressure. You're going to get a little bit dizzy. It's completely normal. Normalizing symptoms, normalizing psychoeducation, more normalizing, more psychoeducation. You're not going to die, and this is what happens when you have an experience. Worst case scenario, you're going to hit a panic state. It's about 10 to 16 seconds. Then you're going to start de-arousing. You're going to start calming down naturally, you know.
Interesting. I mean, and I'm just going to throw something in there, and I
Yeah.
love this stuff because I did a webinar with Fayaz Mughal
Mhm.
OBE the other night, who trained with us
Oh,
recently, and he's into
yes,
counseling,
yes, yeah, yeah.
and he works with OCD. Now it's very interesting because most of his presentation of the case study was actually essentially a strengths-based approach. So he's
Hmm.
very much focused on bolstering and the sense of the person, because he
Yeah.
said that's the actual issue, really, is their sense of self is so
Hmm.
like this, which is a very interesting idea. Still going to go and do the ERP, but before he does the exposure response prevention, a
Hmm.
lot of strengths-based building up and leaning into essentially, particularly hypnosis and if you will, kind of tailored and individualized versions of ego strengthening. So the
Hmm.
person is like this sense of their self and the new narrative about themselves is being
Hmm.
built. Now, I thought that was fascinating. And I remember seeing a case that Emma presented of working with a 9-year-old girl with panic attacks, where there was no exposure essentially. All she did was a strengths-based approach, building resources and meaning and everything. And then the girl basically that was it. She just that's what so I thought this strengths sometimes I think CBT does get a bit focused on attacking the negative symptoms. And I think this idea of building and bolstering strengths here and a new narrative around strengths, and then the client kind of spontaneously now being in a
Hmm.
position where they're bigger than this issue and they're able to do it, or they can at least do the exposure so much more easily.
Yeah, yeah. Once again, we always look at the sign. This is the beauty of CBT. There isn't just one way of doing things. There are
Mm,
many type of different therapies that come under the umbrella, and ERP is just an example. And strength-based approach and working on resilience, and which is a big thing with Mickenbaum as well, right? And so many that many. It all depends on the individual. It depends on the individual, their values, their culture, their abilities, their plans and goals. You might need to invest some time just establishing some goals so that they can start seeing themselves being in a different position and working towards something. If again, that takes a lot of that's what the assessment is about. And assessment is not just about the first stage of the engagement. I mean, not to mention, again, I keep on being critical to other schools of thought, and I almost hate myself. I can't hold back. Um, but in other schools of thought, there is no assessment. So you end up in a situation where the blind is leading the blind, because if there's no assessment, you don't understand the nature of the problem. You're just having a conversation about the difficulty and why they're there, and then you plan another session and then more conversations. And so, well, you need to actually narrow it down to what the problem is, but also what the goals are from here on. And
and there's goals of
along this,
therapy and there's life goals as well. I mean, these are two kind of different
absolutely,
things.
which need to coincide,
Yeah, yeah.
because the life goals, then how we're going, the life goals would become the goals of therapy, getting you closer to the life goals. And if these life goals, I mean, I have people coming to me because we have the magic wand question, right? If I had a magic wand and I could wave it to you, and I could grant all your wishes, what would those wishes be? And usually John comes back and says, I just want to be happy. And I'm like, fine. Well, how does the happy John look like? What does he do more of on a daily basis and less of? What kind of stuff does he like to do? What kind of activities is he involved with? You see, and then we gradually operationalize it, break it down into behavioral terms, into behavioral, we
I mean,
strategize everything.
what I hear is you saying, we're asking these questions that is making you say that we work hard as therapists, but honestly, the person that's really, really working hard, if we're doing the therapy well, is the client.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
sometimes I've said, when we're doing some of this work, you can feel like you're making the brain go through new pathways and carve out like new pathways. And they've been doing this old way of thinking so long that it kind of nearly, I don't want to say their brain is changed by that way of thinking, but there will be actual
There will be.
there will be
Again,
structural changes
yeah.
that have occurred.
I mean,
So
again, there's
at,
data
at
on
a
this.
micro level, certainly, and
Yeah,
we could even, when we look at something like
absolutely.
IBS, we're seeing, other structural changes that are occurring. However, we're actually making it go against all those ingrained habits and structures and pushing the information through a different pathway, and it's hard work for that. It's hard for us a bit, but you can feel them that when you're
It's
asking
even
these
harder for
questions.
them. Yeah, they carry the burden. But this is, again, we go back to responsibility. We have these goals now. You have a responsibility to get there. My job is to quite literally hold your hand, or I'll be there to keep motivating you and reminding you. But you're gonna have to do the hard work every single time a new client calls me. And I don't get that many self-referrals. Other people, other clinicians refer to me and so on. But when I do, or even if it is from somebody else, the first question is, you have to understand that this is behavioral therapy. And what you do in between these sessions it matters more than what happens during our sessions. Or is as important as, so I'm placing much more emphasis on everyday. It's about changes that you need to bring into your life in general. It's a new lifestyle. You have that responsibility. You owe it to yourself if you've decided that you want to get better. But of course, you can always step back and say, well, it's easier to just be unwell. In that case, I can refer you to my colleague who's an analyst.
Oh,
That's very unfair.
That was very
and
unfair.
he knows who he is too. Yes, because
So
I hope he's not online. Yeah.
Let's bring this wrap up. We've been going a little bit over time here, but I've just so much enjoyed talking to you. Let's talk about this idea that kind of you've introduced. I know some other people have, but we kind of, I mean, I've been a bit involved, but integrative CBT, and the way in which now we've asked you to look at the amount of cognitive behavioral therapy in our hypnotherapy diploma. It's not really a hypnotherapy diploma. It's much more, in a way, I think of it as a CBT type of diploma. But we did bring you in as an expert to assess kind of what the teaching program is that we run in terms of its strength and validity in terms of CBT. And yet it's also not a standard kind of your kind of approach that you see. So could you speak to that a little bit, and perhaps let people know a little bit about your views of this integrative model that we've talked about, and the benefits of studying that, and these extra bits that we've added, these extra modules we've added as well, the certificate in integrative CBT as well.
There are 2 or 3 things to mention here that are worth noting. I think we're moving on from a world where we rely too much on a psychiatric diagnosis. That's number one. The reason why we need to be doing that and have a wider offer is because not everybody fits neatly into a diagnostic criteria. Not everybody that suffers, and then there's another aspect to this, not everybody that suffers from depression has 0 symptoms of anxiety, or vice versa. People suffer from multiple conditions. It's called comorbidity. People fall in between the cracks. They don't suffer from a clear DSM type or ICD type disorder, DSM being the diagnostic manual, right? So they don't fit into a criteria. So then we need to come up with something. We need to come up with something that's transdiagnostic. It's a bit of a mouthful. I know that's a bit of a weird label, but something that works across multiple diagnoses, that doesn't rely so much on the diagnostic criteria. So, but we're focusing on symptoms. We're focusing on how the individual feels tense, in what way they feel tense. Are they too hyper, too nervous? Are they experiencing certain? We're focusing on emotions. We're treating fears. We're treating sadness. We're treating loss, and so on and so forth. And I think it's about understanding that CBT is an umbrella term for a number of therapies. And there are lots of different methods that come under the umbrella of CBT that could really contribute to this phenomena, the phenomena of this. It's not a new phenomena. I think it's been around for a long time, but we haven't been very good at identifying it. For instance, stress. We're all suffering with stress and burnout from time to time. But if you go to your GP, unless you get diagnosed with depression, you're not going to get any help. And if you're diagnosed with depression, you're going to get an antidepressant. That's not going to help you with your burnout, because it's not going to offer you any coping strategies at work where you're experiencing burnout. It's not going to help you see yourself in a different light, assess your ability and your performance differently, more accurately, more in line with the reality and the evidence. It's not going to help you maximize your potential at work, and so on and so forth. Because if we're talking about burnout or stress or a loss or anything like that. So we have all these tools that we can package them up neatly into different protocols to treat non-diagnosable conditions that may or may not be part of something bigger. Like I said, states of anxiety, shame, guilt, loss, and stress and burnout. I think this is where the concept of integrative CBT comes from, where we already have very good methods from the United States and Barlow and so on, Professor Barlow, and a lot of my own model, NACBT, I think is a huge contribution on shame and guilt in my view. But then,
so I'm hearing you talk about here that taking an approach that's not trying to put people into categories so much, but a more individually focused approach that's got a high degree of flexibility based off a number of different models and therefore an aspect of adaptation and creativity from the therapist.
And also, you don't have to have a first degree in psychology or a medical degree in psychiatry to practice this. Is there a need? I mean, psychiatry is much more to do with assessments, diagnosing. Again, it's too much reliance on, there's too much reliance out there, generally speaking, from the clinical psychology and psychiatric establishment on the medical disease model. And when it comes to pharmaceutical treatments and future research, that's useful, no doubt about it, in my view. But then there are all these other, somebody that experiences overwhelming shame or guilt, or would like to perform better at work and do not trust themselves. Somebody that has low self-esteem, but don't really have doesn't really have episodes of suicidal ideation and major depressive disorder alongside that. It's just low self-esteem, lacking confidence. Somebody that's a little bit shy, but doesn't quite meet the criteria for social anxiety. And there's a lot out there that we can do. These guys deserve as much help as everybody else, and if there is help for somebody suffering from a major depressive disorder from the psychiatric establishment, I can assure you that everybody else just falls through the cracks. So there's a whole market out there
to help people who aren't who are struggling. And I think it's interesting,
and are not accessing. They're not accessing services because there's nothing there.
Yeah. One of the encouraging things I see with watching some of the people we've trained put through the program is their level of, as I get, with Fayaz, their level of kind of creativity and adaptation, and different things. I was interviewing Celia on weight loss, and she was talking about, we'd always done this thing about before you eat, then taking a few moments of mindfulness. I think she pretty much said, yeah, but it's a bit boring and people won't do it after a while. They just don't do it. So what she has them do is 2 minutes of self-hypnosis, which is like not just relaxing, but imagining not just how they're going to eat this food, but actually how their life is this day
Mm,
and this week and this month and their future is going to go, which is much more exciting than doing
yeah,
2 minutes of mindfulness. And
exactly.
it's like it gears them up. So I was like, that's brilliant. 2 minutes of self-hypnosis before you eat. And then somebody else, Denise Iodash, she was talking at a very high level about what she does. She goes, Mark, fundamentally, what I do is I sow doubt about their negative beliefs and I sprinkle hope. I sow doubt and I sprinkle hope. And
Yeah,
I thought, what a poetic but quite deep understanding
yeah,
of her fundamental processes. So
yeah,
I'm very encouraged when I hear these stories and see the way that people are using it. What we're
yeah.
teaching here
And
in a
there's a
very,
wealth of
not a
experience
formulaic
that,
way, a very creative and
yeah.
even poetic way.
Yeah, no, no, there isn't. There's a reason, and for those formulas that work, and then we can also use those um, prescribed protocols in very, very creative ways. I mean, it's the college is evidently very, very good at enhancing creativity and encouraging creativity. You know, waking that part of the brain up a little bit, I think, the creative part, and that's just something that the college is good at, and I think that it shows in those that have graduated eventually. Uh,
But as you say, they've got to understand the fundamental theories and principles and basic
you go
frameworks
through the
to
exactly,
have that
you get the
first.
basics right, and then it's just getting creative because once again, we haven't got the traditional constraints of other traditional lists. Like other traditional psychotherapists that rely on boundaries very much, 15-minute session on the dot, no handshake, no, no physical touch, no crying in the session, no, no self-disclosure, long silence gaps, and all the rest of it. There. There is no evidence out there that any of these tools work. Actually, they're a little bit dated, and once again, I know I'm going to be hated for this, but I need to just drop it and get on with the program.
Well, and also, I think, I mean, to speak to something you've been kind of mentioning tonight, we haven't kind of focusing on completely, but something that we make very explicit is this, what we could call a multimodal focus in terms of
Hmm.
not necessarily valuing cognition or emotion or behavior, uh, any one of those as being the only thing you focus on. We want to address all three.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I
Yeah.
think some of the issues with cognitive therapy is some people, and I think it's actually due to their personality styles are attracted to the therapists are attracted to the cognitive model, just the
Hmm.
cognitive model, and they're not
Yeah.
able to be there and get into the emotions and work with emotion and work and be behaviorally focused as well because they're a bit too cognitive. I'd be interested to do a study of the personality characteristics of psychotherapists in terms of the training models they choose.
Yeah. Don't even get me started. I've got my.
I think
Uh,
we could do a personality assessment and nearly predict some of the therapy models they might lean towards,
yeah.
and even within CBT, splitting it out to be a little bit more, hey, problem focus, let's just help you, let's get in and solve problems, bit
Yeah.
deeper on the
I mean,
thoughts,
this is
you know.
why the one of the good things that has always been very valid coming out of the traditional psychotherapy schools, is the having appropriate therapy and the clinical supervisor oneself, the trainee. Without that support, without that guidance, without the counselor or coach there on your side, uh, and ongoing support, I it's impossible to go on. You just cannot. It's impossible to progress in this line of work. You need a second brain there to hold you. You need a second brain to bounce ideas of each other, and so
Well, and I
yes.
think particularly, I was really thinking also in terms of people's initial training, supervision as the way in which you safely and also confidently, without getting overstressed, expand your sphere of competence, so that,
Absolutely.
you know, and from any training, you know,
Yeah.
you're not
Yeah.
competent to work with severe complex mental disorders at the start. That is
Yeah.
something that may or may not evolve later, but the only way to get there is to take on one or two slightly more difficult cases than you're usually used to, but that's where you really are leaning into your supervision.
Yeah.
Right?
And look, I mean, again, at both at the college, but in the world of CBT in general, this is the best exposure type therapy that one can have, because you are learning to expose yourself to your worst fear of embarrassing yourself in front of your supervisor, coming up with talking about your mistakes, talking about your errors. But it's that makes you a good therapist. That's what's going to make it. Owning that and saying, I'm doubting my approach. I'm going to criticize myself, and me as your supervisor will be there to tell you, well, let's look at this as a thought. First of all, are
That's
you
an
having a
irrational
thought?
thought.
Are you having a thought that you're underperforming, or what was your client's response? Have they done anything about it, and so on and so forth. Let's unpack it. So there's all that work, and again, this fear of embarrassing yourself, shame sometimes that we carry about our performance, not wanting to fail as a therapist and so on, or not wanting to be seen as inadequate, inappropriate. You deal with this. That's hard work, and but that's growth. That's real growth, because you would be doing the same to your clients.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And
That's
very
that's where the
often
learning, the practical
those
experience.
those doubts that you might be experiencing about yourself are connecting in with some old self-beliefs as well, that, you know,
Yeah,
we need to notice and be aware of, because they're going to
absolutely.
sabotage us if we give them too much credence and time and space.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Fantastic, Daniel. Well, we're going to call it a close because we're over time, and I can see some people here thanking us but having to go. So let me just finish by asking you, let's see how you do with this one. What's your favorite question to ask in therapy?
My favorite question.
Yeah.
Ah, oh gosh, I have that. I have a few. Actually, I can tell you my least favorite uh, question is probably what's going on through your mind. What was going on through your mind at that particular point in time? I think that's a very tough question to ask, and for a client to answer. They're
So you don't like
very.
that one. You don't
I
like that
don't like that one.
one. Okay.
But there, I don't like that one, but not so much. But although sometimes you have to, but maybe a favorite one that would go the opposite of that is what is it that you were experiencing in that moment? What is it that you were feeling in that moment, perhaps, or um, uh, that I think that's the experience. The question about the experience. It's almost to begin with. Um, I think it opens up so many doors rather than targeting the thoughts quite early, and then you get into, once you start talking about the experience, you then move on to separating, and that's my other favorite question. Um, which is, well, is that a thought or is that a feeling? Are you talking to me about an emotion right now, or you think you've had uh, it's that experience? And so what's the difference? So thinking, I feel stupid, it's not a feeling. That's a thought, right? So how does feeling stupid really feel? That's another favorite question. So, like I said, I have a few. How does feeling stupid really feel? When people are talking to me about their 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 confusing thought with feeling, I love unpacking that with them.
Mm.
Um, yeah. How does feeling stupid really feel?
And what happens as they get into that? What's is the this is a
Well, it's a bit of a shock to begin with, because they're like, "Oh wow, yeah, I it I feel shy and embarrassed. It depends. It's to do with the context. So then you play around with the threes, right? With the fours rather. So situation, thoughts, feelings, behaviors, because they're like, okay, and when you feel when you know, I felt very embarrassed, and I have felt shy, and in that situation. But it's interesting that you were thinking that you're stupid, you're acting stupid, you're acting silly, and that led on to this feeling of embarrassment. And then what did you do with that? And then oh, and I went you know, I wanted to deflect it and told a joke, and did that work? No, it didn't, because I still felt stupid, because my joke didn't really, nobody was laughing. So I feel even more stupid. And so now we have a vicious circle all of a sudden, because it also, so this kind of type of Socratic dialogue, I love it. And I don't think it's one particular question. It's just like you go with the experience, you go with the narrative that you presented, and you try to unpack it in this beautiful format. And Don is using the clock metaphor. I use the word experience to get, what did you experience in that moment?
I was nearly going for, well, kind of that moment of when you're asking that question that has them start to recognize and that this isn't a feeling, this was a thought, and that's a feeling. What are they feeling at that moment of recognition? In other words, there's a kind of light bulb moment that's quite, it's got a certain a power and beautiful energy to it, of of insight, you know, and I love that kind of, that firstness, if you will, of them suddenly seeing that, you know, there's a wonder to that, and a certain electric moment in their brain that's going off there, as
the
they
discovery of something.
See,
that triggers an individual. That triggers, for me, that sort of language and these sort of approaches, which are so typical to all CBT therapies. We're all using slightly different approaches and maybe language that we acquire over time. But that opens up so many possibilities, and rooted in this curiosity. Oh, wow, that's interesting, isn't it? That's really interesting. That clearly, obviously, hello, if I'm going to think I'm stupid, I'm going to be like overwhelmed with like, ugh, you know, I'm going to feel tense and unpleasant, and I'm going to act stupid. I think I'm stupid. I feel inside this stupidity, which is actually just fear, really. I'm feeling uncomfortable and anxious. And then I start acting bizarrely, which makes me feel stupid even more so. Here we go. I can do something about this, which is maybe stop telling yourself you're stupid and just go with the flow and, you know, take some risks. Tell another joke.
The sense I'm getting here, and coming back to some of the stuff you were saying right at the beginning, is one of your aims, maybe it's unstated here, is for them to develop, really strongly develop, their own curiosity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I'm gonna let's leave it on that quite kind of big note. How do we help our clients develop their own natural curiosity and the joy of discovery within that curiosity process, which implies some creativity as well, and perspective taking and everything? Fabulous, Daniel. I love talking this through with you, and I hope this has been helpful to people listening, and you've enjoyed this. Mirea times 30. With a lot of Marias in the attendee list here, but I'm sorry we couldn't see all your individual names, but great to have you here. Thank you, Daniel. Great to be with you. Everybody, if you've got any questions about the diploma, the CBT in it, write to it. If you want to know about this certificate in integrative CBT that you can get awarded when you take the diploma, simply by doing a few extra questions and a couple of book reviews, because 90% of the CBT is in the diploma, right, Daniel? And then we've added this little extra bit on. Put some questions in. We're happy to speak to that and talk about that. But fabulous, Daniel. Thank you so much. Anybody wants to join me this Friday, I'm doing Q&A at 1 o'clock, and you can join in its open session. We'll probably do a little bit of a hypnosis as well. And then next, on November 7th, we have Dr. Chrissy Iving going to be coming in and talking about her experience of using CBT and then adding hypnosis to it. And we're also going to talk a little bit about smoking cessation and vaping, because that's also, we're both really interested into that as a topic. So join me for that. And that's also, she works with horse riders, equestrian and sports hypnosis, and CBT. So she's going to talk about that too. Thank you all. Thank you, Daniel. Fabulous.
Thanks again.
You. Lovely to see you again.
Great.
Take care.
Bye-bye
Good
for
night,
now.
everybody.